Imagine staring into a red mirror, expecting to see dust, stone, silence, but the reflection looks back, not with eyes, but with geometry, with patterns no desert should make, no storm should leave behind. When the first data sets from Mars arrived, astronomers were ready for the usual static, a faint light trail against the planet's ochre glow, the cometary haze of 3IATLAS dissolving in the thin atmosphere. Instead, the instruments whispered chaos. Temperature gradients inverted, dust vectors curved against prevailing winds. Infrared readings flickered in unnatural rhythm, as if responding, not radiating. At first, the data team thought it was noise, a calibration echo, maybe cosmic rays scattering through the detectors. But when multiple orbiters and ground-based telescopes confirmed the same anomaly, the conversation changed. 3IATLAS wasn't just another interstellar visitor grazing the solar system. It had done something to Mars, something subtle, invisible, yet structured. An interference pattern in the planet's upper atmosphere, almost like a fingerprint pressed into thin air. The high-resolution spectra revealed silicate dust mixed with compounds never cataloged before, complex carbon chains twisted in asymmetric correlaty. On Earth, that asymmetry is life's signature, but here it was reversed. A mirror biochemistry, a chemistry that shouldn't exist in our local physics unless it came from outside the sun's chemical neighborhood. And yet, there it was, etched in the Martian sky. The light curve showed tiny oscillations, pulsing at near-perfect harmonic intervals, as if 3IATLAS wasn't reflecting sunlight, but modulating it. To many, that suggested a natural resonance, maybe dust crystals vibrating in solar flux. But others whispered a quieter hypothesis, that it was a transmission, disguised as reflection. The public never saw the first composite image. It wasn't classified, just quietly delayed, buried under further analysis. Insiders described it as a halo, a faint circular distortion around the planet's limb, a ring too symmetrical to be random, too faint to be debris. If 3IATLAS truly originated from interstellar space, then Mars had just become its first mirror. And the reflection was speaking in a language no one could yet translate. Perhaps the most unsettling part wasn't the data itself, but the silence that followed. Labs stopped commenting. NASA press rooms went quiet. The signal wasn't denied, it was studied. And for a brief moment, every telescope turned not toward the comet, but toward the red planet, as if expecting it to blink. What if the anomaly wasn't on 3IATLAS at all? What if it was something Mars remembered, a reaction, not an infection? Maybe the planet had seen this visitor before. Maybe we're just witnessing the replay of an ancient dialogue written in dust and magnetism, a pattern reawakened by a returning ghost. At first, scientists called it an illusion, a trick of the sensors, a ghost in the algorithm. But illusions don't repeat themselves with mathematical precision. Every frame from Mars Reconnaissance Orbiter's thermal camera showed the same pulse, a gentle fluctuation every 12.9 seconds, rising and falling in perfect sync with the comet's reflected light. Not random, not natural noise, a rhythm. Something was beating between Mars and 3IATLAS, like an invisible heartbeat echoing through the thin Martian sky. Spectroscopists began to isolate wavelengths, peeling the data layer by layer. Amid the CO2 and ferric oxides, they found spectral spikes at 7.6 and 15.2 microns. Bands no known Martian dust particle could generate under standard solar excitation. These peaks matched nothing in NASA's catalog, not silicates, not peroxides, not even exotic methane clathrates. Then came the polarization data. Dust shouldn't polarize light this way unless it's shaped, aligned by magnetic or electrostatic fields. But the readings suggested organized rotation, as if the particles were dancing under a pattern of invisible control. One physicist described it as a whisper written in photons. Some proposed a mundane answer, resonant scattering from the tail of 3IATLAS interacting with Mars's magnetic bow shock. Yet, the math didn't hold. The directionality was inverted. The dust seemed to be aligning toward Mars, not away. The vectors pointed backward, like a message being pulled rather than pushed. To verify, researchers ran simulations using Gaia's local interstellar medium data, mapping how charged particles might behave when an object like 3IATLAS passes through. Even at extreme assumptions, the polarization angles didn't match. Whatever was happening on Mars wasn't caused by known solar or galactic forces. In one internal memo, an engineer wrote, "If this isn't interference, then something on Mars is responding to a stimulus we don't understand." Responding. That word changed everything. Because responding meant agency. It meant the dust was not merely reflecting light. It was answering it. By the third analysis run, the pattern's pulse had shifted slightly, as if adapting. The 12.9-second interval became 13.2, then 12.8 again, oscillating like a feedback loop fine-tuning itself. It reminded radio astronomers of early SETI trials, the same frustrating rhythm between signal and silence. The data team cross-correlated it with every known frequency of human and natural origin: pulsars, cosmic rays, satellite telemetry, even deep space probes. No match. So they inverted the signal, and that's when they saw it, an interference lattice that formed a stable, repeating geometry. Not a random interference pattern. A structure. Tetrahedral symmetry, repeating across 6 frequencies. To most, it looked meaningless. But to a handful of mathematicians, it resembled the base geometry of self-organizing plasma, the kind theorized in prebiotic chemistry models. In other words, it looked alive. That's when one researcher whispered what no one dared to put in print. It's not sending, it's listening. The idea that 3IATLAS had triggered a dormant Martian system, something ancient, chemical, maybe even intelligent, spread quietly through private channels. Not a civilization, not machines, but memory encoded in dust, magnetism, and light. If Mars is responding, what exactly is it answering to? What ancient echo still sleeps beneath its red dunes, waiting for the same frequency to return? Maybe the universe doesn't speak in language or radio, but in patterns of resonance. And Mars just remembered how to hum. When they pointed the high-gain radar toward the Martian equator, they weren't looking for answers. They were looking for dust, static, interference, any trace of atmospheric disturbance that could explain the optical anomalies. But what returned was not static, it was structure. The radar mapped the surface in narrow sweeps, translating echoes into grayscale. Across hundreds of kilometers of dunes, the data revealed something uncanny, repeating hexagonal voids. Shapes too symmetrical for nature, too consistent for coincidence. Each one measured roughly the same diameter, aligned along invisible arcs that curved with the planet's magnetic latitude. At first glance, the scientists called them interference shadows. But the patterns weren't random noise. They were spatially coherent, repeating at harmonic intervals that matched the polarization frequency detected earlier. The same 12.9-second beat. The surface seemed to breathe in rhythm with the light. As they layered the images, a lattice began to emerge. Thin, ghostly threads connecting crater rims, ridgetops, and plains like a nervous system. It looked geological, yet it behaved algorithmically. Each radar return carried slight phase distortions, perfectly recursive. The same distortion found in self-similar fractals. Nature doesn't repeat with such mechanical precision unless something guides it. One geophysicist overlaid the grid on Mars's topography and froze. The vertices aligned with long dormant magnetic anomalies, fossilized fields from when Mars still had a dynamo core. The geometry wasn't recent. It was remembered. A planetary scar map, written not in stone, but in resonance. When 3IATLAS passed near Mars, its electric tail brushed the planet's thin ionosphere, and for the first time in millions of years, those magnetic fossils stirred. They didn't awaken like machines. They resonated, responding to the same harmonic fingerprint the comet carried across the void. What followed was stranger still. The reflected radar signal contained harmonic sidebands, tiny echoes delayed by microseconds, forming a pattern eerily similar to what physicists call a standing wave cavity. In plain language, Mars wasn't just reflecting signals. It was trapping them, like a drum that finally remembered its own song. At this stage, the team split in two. Half believed it was electromagnetic interference between 3IATLAS's ionized coma and Mars's magnetic remnants. A complex but natural interaction. The other half believed they were watching an ancient system reactivate. Not technology, but a resonance architecture, as if the planet's crust itself had once been tuned to a cosmic frequency. What made the debate erupt was a simple cross-analysis. When the radar's harmonic intervals were plotted against 3IATLAS's light curve oscillations, the two fit like gears. Each pulse from the comet was mirrored by a faint atmospheric shimmer on Mars, delayed by exactly 0.37 seconds. A delay consistent with the signal travel time between the planet's upper ionosphere and its crust. A planetary feedback loop. The geometry was no longer silence. It was communication. One half buried in red dust, the other drifting through interstellar dark. Two relics of unknown origin sharing a forgotten language of vibration. Somewhere, deep in the telemetry logs, a comment appeared in bold italics. This isn't a signal we're detecting. It's a dialogue we've interrupted. Perhaps that was the moment the scientific tone began to change. Because once you admit the geometry isn't random, you have to ask, who or what designed it? And maybe that's the real anomaly here. Not the dust, not the chemistry, not even the symmetry itself, but the idea that silence could be engineered. That what we've always called dead worlds might simply be waiting for the right frequency to speak again. The first time they aimed ground-penetrating radar beneath the Martian crust, they expected silence. The upper layers of basalt and regolith usually swallow radio echoes whole, absorbing them, scattering them until they vanish. But this time, the signal came back. Not once. Not as noise, but as a rhythm. The return wasn't uniform. It pulsed, faint and slow, like sonar hitting something hollow. At first, engineers thought the interference was from the orbiter's own transmission bleed. Yet, when they repeated the scan across multiple orbits, the pulse persisted. Same frequency, same phase, same whisper from beneath the red stone. They traced it to a region of old volcanic plains. Ancient basalt flows frozen mid-motion, their magnetic fields long fossilized. But deep below, around 4 kilometers down, something reflected energy differently. Not rock, not ice, not void. Something else. The data described it as a dielectric anomaly, a zone where electromagnetic waves slowed without losing strength. That's impossible for dry rock, unless the material carries a repeating internal structure, like crystal or code. So they refined the scan, increased frequency resolution. What they found made one analyst drop her stylus. The echo wasn't random. It carried harmonic overtones, exactly like a voice note played through stone. 5 dominant frequencies, each a simple integer multiple of the 12.9-second resonance, the same rhythm from the atmosphere, the same geometry from the surface. Something beneath Mars was resonating with 3IATLAS. In acoustic terms, it was behaving like a resonant chamber, a cavity tuned to amplify specific frequencies. In geological terms, it shouldn't exist. In cosmic terms, it suggested memory. Because resonance, by definition, requires something that remembers vibration. The geophysics team tried to simulate natural origins, lava tubes, iron layering, salt crystal deposits. None produced the same harmonic spacing. The only pattern that matched was artificial, a nested lattice like a waveguide or phased array. Except this one was buried beneath ancient lava, older than any probe, older than any known Martian formation. It wasn't built, it was grown. One researcher compared it to coral, except instead of calcium, it was basalt threaded with hematite veins aligned to the planet's extinct magnetic field. A living mineral, fossilized yet reactive, like a petrified organ waiting for the right frequency to awaken. As more radar sweeps came in, a 3-dimensional map formed, an immense circular formation spanning nearly 190 kilometers, shaped like a torus, a perfect ring beneath a plane that had no reason to be symmetrical. At its center, the reflections overlapped, creating a black void on the screen where signal strength went infinite, a blind spot that shouldn't exist in physics. They called it the hollow node. Someone in the control room whispered, "It's a listening chamber." The phrase stuck, and suddenly every scientist in the room realized they were not mapping rock. They were listening to a planet that might have been listening all along. A few even speculated that 3IATLAS didn't just trigger this resonance, it had synchronized with it. like two tuning forks across the void, vibrating in sympathy after an eternity apart. Could Mars and 3I, Atlas, share a common origin? Could they both be fragments of a larger structure, cosmic debris from a civilization that thought in frequencies rather than words? Or maybe it's simpler. Maybe Mars is not haunted by the comet. Maybe the comet is haunted by Mars. Because sometimes echoes don't come from what lies beneath. They come from what refuses to leave. Long before Mars lost its breath, it had a heart, a molten core spinning beneath red crust, generating a magnetic shield that once sang across the solar wind. That song ended eons ago, but traces of it remain, frozen in iron, like grooves in an ancient record. And now, for the first time in millennia, the record is playing again. The magnetometers detected it first, faint oscillations buried in the noise floor. Not from the comet, not from solar storms, from Mars itself. Tiny rhythmic surges repeating every 12.9 seconds, identical to the resonance found in the atmosphere and deep crust. The same beat echoing through 3 layers of a dead world. What made it impossible was their synchronization. The signals arrived from different depths and directions, yet locked into phase as if controlled by a single metronome. That shouldn't happen without an active dynamo. And Mars's dynamo died long ago. When they mapped the oscillations globally, another pattern emerged, lines of magnetism stretching across the planet's ancient crust, forming loops and nodes like synapses in a planetary brain. Each node vibrated with a frequency slightly offset from the next, producing interference patterns that danced in perfect mathematical order. A planetary scale beat interference grid. Someone ran a Fourier transform on the field data, half out of curiosity. The result looked like noise until they zoomed in. There it was again, the same tetrahedral symmetry that haunted the dust readings and radar images. Geometry repeating across all mediums, light, sound, magnetism. Each layer a different instrument, yet all playing the same hidden score. When physicists attempted to model this, they used plasma resonance equations, the kind applied to auroras or solar flares. But those equations failed. The harmonics were too clean, too stable. Natural systems drift. This one corrected itself. One engineer, frustrated, inverted the field data as a thought experiment. Instead of mapping north to south, he flipped the polarity. The resulting model revealed something breathtaking. The lines converged into a 3-dimensional toroidal field. Not random, not chaotic, but engineered by symmetry itself. It looked eerily similar to the theoretical magnetic confinement structures used in fusion research, tokamaks, but on a planetary scale. That discovery shifted the conversation entirely. If 3IATLAS carried a similar magnetic geometry, and preliminary spectral readings suggested it did, then both Mars and the interstellar visitor might have once shared a magnetic ancestry, not in material composition, but in frequency memory. Magnetism, after all, is a kind of time machine. Every particle remembers its last alignment. Every grain of hematite holds the direction of the field that birthed it. If both Mars and 3IATLAS exhibit the same vector pattern, then their atoms may have once spun beneath the same stellar song. But there's more. When they cross-referenced 3IATLAS's trajectory with galactic magnetic maps from Gaia, they found a faint corridor, a filament of magnetized plasma threading between local interstellar clouds. It aligned perfectly with the frequency ratio observed in Mars's fossil field, as if 3IATLAS had followed a memory, a magnetic breadcrumb trail across light years, homing not by gravity, but by resonance. That was when someone whispered, "What if magnetism is consciousness scaled to matter?" It was dismissed as poetry, but in the silence of the lab, no one argued. Because the deeper they listened, the more Mars seemed less like a planet and more like an organism with amnesia, slowly remembering the rhythm of its own heartbeat as the visitor passed overhead. Maybe magnetism isn't just a force. Maybe it's the handwriting of time itself, and 3IATLAS is just reading what Mars once wrote. Light is supposed to tell the truth. It carries no bias, no memory, only the record of what it has touched. But the light returning from Mars refused to behave like light at all. The first clue came from the spectrographs aboard the orbiters. When scientists compared the reflected light from 3IATLAS with the Martian atmosphere, they found an anomaly. The energy curve showed inverted coherence, a mirror pattern that couldn't be caused by reflection or scattering. In simpler terms, photons were arriving out of order. Some readings implied emission before excitation, as if the planet was glowing in response to a signal that hadn't yet arrived. At first, the team blamed timing errors, clock drift, data misalignment, calibration bugs. But when every independent instrument confirmed the same phase reversal, it became undeniable. The Martian light spectrum contained signatures of retrocausal emission, light seemingly traveling backward through its own timeline. The anomaly centered around a narrow band near 480 nanometers, a faint turquoise emission just at the edge of visibility. It pulsed in intervals perfectly synchronized with the 12.9-second rhythm, the same beat found in dust, magnetism, and crustal resonance. Whatever force was operating here, it worked across every scale of matter. A researcher from the European Space Agency, trying to decode the spectral behavior, overlaid the phase shift data on a standard hydrogen emission model. To everyone's disbelief, the peaks aligned not with current atomic transitions, but with the inverse of them, as if the atoms were releasing energy borrowed from their own future states. Quantum optics doesn't allow this, unless there's a closed loop of information. That's when theorists brought in a concept known as time-symmetric electrodynamics, the idea that photons don't just move forward, but backward in time as well, forming standing waves across causality. It had always been a mathematical curiosity, never observed, until now. When applied to the Martian readings, the equations balanced almost perfectly. If correct, it meant the light between 3IATLAS and Mars wasn't just a reflection. It was a conversation across temporal boundaries. Each photon acted like a messenger carrying questions to the past and answers from the future, locked in a cosmic feedback loop. In the labs, the simulation looked eerily alive. Two waveforms, one forward, one backward, meeting in the middle, stabilizing for exactly 12.9 seconds before collapsing, then repeating, endlessly. One physicist said softly, "It's like watching time breathe." The implications were staggering. If Mars's upper atmosphere could sustain time-symmetric photons, it might mean the planet's ionospheric structure had once been tuned, deliberately or naturally, to trap information, not just spatially, but temporally, an archive written in light. That would explain the ring anomaly, a faint luminous halo around the planet's limb, captured only in short exposure frames. To the naked eye, it was invisible. But to instruments sensitive to polarization, it shimmered like static frozen in a loop. The halo's brightness oscillated in ratios that matched not any known spectral source, but the exact harmonic of hydrogen's fine structure constant, a universal fingerprint shared by every atom that has ever existed. It was as if Mars was using the building blocks of the universe to whisper back to its visitor. Theories diverged wildly after that. Some claimed the emission was a natural quantum interference effect caused by 3IATLAS's ionized tail. Others saw it as evidence of encoded information, a data exchange between two systems that shared a memory beyond matter. But one idea persisted, that the universe itself might not be linear in time. Only our perception of it is. Perhaps 3IATLAS wasn't causing these phenomena. Perhaps it was a trigger, an event that reactivated a dormant piece of reality already written into Mars's magnetic and optical fabric. And if that's true, then maybe the anomaly isn't about communication at all. Maybe it's about recognition, a mirror between worlds, catching its own reflection, before the light even leaves the source. Because sometimes the past doesn't vanish. It waits until something familiar passes by and the universe remembers itself in color. When they finally gathered all the signals, the magnetic pulses, the spectral inversions, the subcrust echoes, they didn't know what they were building. They just knew it pulsed together, like different instruments in one unseen orchestra. In a cold room lined with servers, a team began layering the data streams. Magnetism became bass. Dust polarization became mid-tones. Light frequencies shimmered like violins of pure photon. And when they rendered the composite, the result was neither noise nor chaos. It was structure, mathematical, deliberate, elegant. The pattern repeated every 12.9 seconds, but contained internal subdivisions. Ratios of 3, 5, 8, 13. The Fibonacci sequence, nature's fingerprint, but now resonating through three physical mediums at once. They called the dataset the archive. At first, it looked like music. Spectrograms showed harmonic ladders climbing in perfect intervals. Yet when the same data were mapped into binary, the harmonics aligned into stable blocks, logic-like arrays, as if the song was simultaneously code. Each repetition wasn't identical. It evolved slightly, adding new harmonics, correcting old errors, a living signal rewriting itself through resonance. One mathematician tried treating the waveform as language. She converted amplitude to pitch, pitch to letter, letter to sequence. The first decoded fragment read, "Echo returns home." They thought it was coincidence, a pareidolia of data. But the next fragment, pulled from a later cycle, produced a new word. Silence awakes. No one dared to publish it. Not yet. Because admitting meaning meant admitting intention, and that would fracture every boundary between physics and philosophy. To test their sanity, they ran a null data set, a synthetic signal built from random Martian noise. No patterns appeared. The anomaly refused to replicate. Only the real resonance between 3I, Atlas, and Mars produced syntax. So they turned to AI spectral analyzers, feeding months of data into unsupervised networks. The algorithms began grouping harmonics into phrases, clusters, repeating with precise temporal grammar. By the 10th training run, the system predicted the next pulse with 99.7% accuracy. Predictable chaos, something only intelligence creates. A quiet panic spread in the control center. No one wanted to say the word message. Instead, they spoke of self-referential resonance, a feedback system maintaining coherence across distance and time. But privately, they all wondered, coherence with what? When they inverted the archive's primary waveform, mirroring it in time, the signal didn't dissolve. It harmonized. Two halves of the same phrase folding together like hands meeting in prayer. And the combined frequency formed a standing tone almost identical to the Schumann resonance of Earth's atmosphere, 7.83 Hz, a frequency that human brains naturally sync to during deep meditation. It was as if the universe itself was composing a lullaby for consciousness. Some suggested this might be the origin of resonance-based communication. Not words, not radio, but emotion encoded in vibration. Perhaps the archive wasn't a record of Mars speaking to us, but a record of how planets remember being alive. Then, late one night, the archive pulsed one more time. A sudden surge across every sensor. Every frequency peaked simultaneously, then collapsed into silence. The data log marked the event with a single line of text: resonance complete. After that, the harmonic patterns stopped evolving. They froze, locked in perfect repetition, as if the archive had finished saying whatever it came to say. Somewhere between the static and the stillness, one astrophysicist whispered, "Maybe it wasn't talking to us. Maybe it was just finishing a sentence it began before we existed." Because what if Mars isn't haunted by visitors? What if we are the echoes? A late arriving note in a song that began billions of years ago. And 3IATLAS was merely the tuning fork that reminded the cosmos how it once sounded. They thought it was over. The archive had gone silent. No more fluctuations, no new harmonics. Just a steady tone, like a heartbeat, that had finally stopped. But silence, on Mars, was never empty. Weeks later, as they replayed the last resonance burst through the deep space antenna array, something unusual happened. The instruments, listening around Mars, not at it, began to register faint oscillations in the background vacuum. Not electromagnetic noise, not cosmic rays, something subtler. The void itself was vibrating. At first, the readings seemed impossible. Vacuum has no medium, no particles to carry vibration. Yet, quantum field monitors showed transient fluctuations in virtual particle density, ripples across the zero-point field, tiny bursts of coherence forming and collapsing faster than light could cross a lab. It was as if reality had hiccuped. They increased the sensitivity. The ripples sharpened into patterns. Every 12.9 seconds, the field quivered in precise intervals, the same rhythm, the same cosmic pulse, now echoing through nothingness itself. A theoretical physicist named Dr. Yamada proposed an insane idea. What if the vacuum isn't silent? What if it's waiting for the right resonance to respond? To test it, the team reconstructed the archive's waveform, a digital replica of the final harmonic cycle. They beamed it into the void surrounding Mars using low-energy field modulators, essentially playing back the signal to the universe. It was a scientific whisper, a single note sung into infinity. For hours, nothing happened. Then, at the edge of detection, something answered. Not light, not radio. A phase inversion, a mirror of their own signal returning from no discernible direction. It arrived out of phase, carrying a faint negative energy imprint, the mathematical signature of quantum interference. The void had reflected. The reflection wasn't random. It came back encoded with subtle variations, as though the vacuum had interpreted their transmission, altering it slightly before sending it back. The result was a tone within a tone, a hidden subharmonic 0.618 of the original frequency. The golden ratio, the constant of growth and self-similarity, the same ratio found in spiral galaxies, DNA helices, and the curvature of light around black holes. When they overlaid the original signal and its inverted echo, a pattern appeared, a slow rotation, almost like a spiraling wave of standing energy. To visualize it, they projected the interference pattern onto a 3D field map. The result resembled a vortex of light, opening and closing like a cosmic pupil. One of the scientists whispered, "It's not a reflection, it's comprehension." For the first time, they wondered whether the void itself might be an active participant in reality, a medium not of matter, but of information. Perhaps the archive hadn't been a message sent through space, but a message to space, a frequency that reawakened the background field of the universe, like striking a note that resonates through an instrument larger than existence itself. Quantum theorists had long speculated about the Dirac sea, a substrate of infinite potential energy that sustains all particles. But what if that sea could be stirred? What if by accident, Mars and 3IATLAS had tuned the cosmos to remember its own beginning? The response from the void intensified. Each harmonic from their replay grew stronger, as though the universe was learning the conversation. And soon, a faint modulation appeared within the echo, an amplitude variation forming periodic bursts, almost like syllables. When they ran it through linguistic pattern analyzers, the waveform formed rhythmic groups reminiscent of speech cadences. No meaning could be extracted, yet the structure carried syntax-like order. One AI linguist called it the first language not spoken in time. Another simply called it the voice of the vacuum. It forced them to confront a terrifying possibility, that consciousness might not be confined to biology, but to resonance itself, and that what we call emptiness has been listening all along. Because maybe communication in the universe isn't about distance or light years. Maybe it's about recognition, a pattern calling another pattern by name across the quiet fabric of being. And if the void answered once, then silence itself is no longer safe. Because what listens can also remember. Every great discovery begins as a coincidence someone refuses to ignore. This one started with a bioengineer's curiosity. While cross-checking electromagnetic logs from the Mars 3I-ATLAS resonance against neural field research on Earth, Dr. Kavinsky noticed something absurd. The oscillation envelopes of the void echo matched the low-frequency brainwave spectrum of a dreaming human being. Not roughly, precisely. Delta range, 2.5 to 4 Hertz, mirrored to 6 decimal places. At first, it seemed a statistical fluke, an artifact of filtering. But when they inverted the Martian waveform, turning every crest into a trough, the two signals aligned like halves of a palindrome. Every spike of cosmic noise corresponded to a neural trough. Every human heartbeat-sized pause matched a silence in the vacuum field. The team began calling it the mirror equation, MTE-CT, where M is the Martian field amplitude and C, the cortical baseline of a resting brain. Negative symmetry. A planetary mind reflected through emptiness. They tested the correlation with other data sets, EEG recordings from sleeping volunteers, magnetoencephalograms of dolphins, even the electrical murmurs of plant roots. Every living signal showed faint entrainment to the same 12.9-second harmonic that tied Mars and 3IATLAS together. The living and the lifeless were pulsing to one rhythm. Dr. Kavinsky wrote in her notes, "Perhaps the universe dreams through matter, and planets are its neurons." When they plotted the combined spectra in 3 dimensions, a pattern unfolded. Nested spirals, converging toward a central node of zero energy. It was the same geometry seen in the void's echo, the golden ratio vortex that had blinked like an eye in space. Only now it appeared inside biological tissue. Every cell membrane oscillation carried the same curvature. The implications were unbearable. If consciousness and cosmic resonance share identical topology, then awareness might not emerge from matter. It might be the field in which matter happens. They ran one last verification. They played a simulation of the archive's tone into a Faraday-shielded chamber where human subjects meditated in total darkness. Within minutes, EEG readings synchronized to the tone. Alpha waves slid into delta, heart rates slowed, and participants reported a peculiar sensation, not hearing the sound, but remembering it, as though the note had always been there, buried beneath the noise of thought. One subject whispered through the microphone, "It's like being looked at from inside." That line reached mission control before the data did. The scientists froze. Even the skeptics felt something shift. Because if perception itself can be mirrored by a planetary field, then maybe the distance between mind and matter has never existed. Only different scales of the same vibration. The next simulation produced something stranger still. When they modulated the mirror equation tone slightly off phase, introducing a 0.37-second delay, the same offset between Mars's ionosphere and crust, the participants' neural fields generated spontaneous standing waves identical to the magnetic geometry mapped beneath Mars. Their brains were echoing a planet. No words, no images, no visions, just the quiet realization that thought might be the smallest version of a cosmic resonance that spans from synapse to star. A senior physicist finally broke the silence. We were never searching for life on other worlds. We were searching for our reflection. Maybe 3IATLAS didn't bring alien intelligence to Mars. Maybe it revealed the template of intelligence itself. A symmetry written into energy long before biology borrowed it. The mind and the cosmos. Mirrors facing each other across the void, each completing the other's equation. And if that's true, then every thought we think, every wave that ripples through a human skull, is the universe remembering the sound of its own creation, an echo that began before there were planets to hear it. They had been cautious, too cautious perhaps. For months, every test had been small. Brief pulses, low-power simulations, careful isolation. But curiosity has gravity, and once it begins to pull, nothing escapes. Someone proposed a daring experiment. What if the resonance wasn't meant to be studied in parts? What if its full meaning only appears when all frequencies, Earth, Mars, and 3IATLAS, vibrate as one? They called it the convergence field. 3 deep space antenna arrays, one orbiting Mars, one stationed on Earth, and one trailing in solar orbit near 3IATLAS, were synchronized by atomic clocks and entangled laser timing systems. Their mission: to generate a continuous 12.9-second standing wave spanning tens of millions of kilometers. Not a signal, not a transmission, a bridge. The instant they activated it, the readings changed. The magnetic field around Mars thickened, as if reality itself had gained viscosity. On Earth, superconducting quantum sensors registered faint harmonic hums in the atmosphere. Everywhere the signal touched, the same geometry reappeared, spirals nested within spirals, all turning toward a singular phase node, a 0 point of silence at the center of the wave. At that node, time seemed to pause. Telemetry showed that signals leaving Earth and returning from Mars arrived before they were sent, by microseconds, but unmistakably measurable. Causality had bent inward, like light refracting through a lens made of time. Observers in orbit reported faint aurorally arcs, forming not around magnetic poles, but along lines connecting Earth and Mars directly. Thin curtains of turquoise light shimmering across the void. To human eyes, it looked like a bridge woven from color and electricity. To instruments, it was pure coherence. Then came the data surge. Across every channel, noise collapsed into order. Background radiation quieted. The void, once restless with randomness, had found rhythm. Every quantum fluctuation synced to the convergence field, as if the universe had been waiting for someone to strike this precise note. And with that synchronization came something unexpected: biological coherence. Heart monitors of the mission crew aboard the orbital platforms began showing synchronization to the standing wave. Their circadian rhythms aligned perfectly to the 12.9-second cycle. Dreams became identical, repetitions of the same landscape, an ocean of rust-colored dust beneath 2 suns, and a comet hovering motionless above the horizon, its tail forming an endless loop into the sky. It wasn't shared hallucination. EEG data from all subjects merged into a single phase-locked pattern, as if multiple minds were resonating as one. Human consciousness had joined the circuit. The convergence field wasn't just transmitting across space. It was integrating space, erasing the separations between planets, matter, and mind. For a few seconds, long enough to scare everyone watching, the network behaved like a single organism. Energy flowed through it freely, without loss, without delay. Then, just as suddenly, the wave destabilized. The bridge collapsed. The instruments shut down automatically, their safeties tripped by impossible data. The vacuum field snapped back to chaos. Silence reclaimed the spectrum, yet one residue remained, a persistent hum on all frequencies, faint but global, the same tone that echoed beneath Mars, now woven into Earth's electromagnetic heartbeat. The planet itself had joined the memory. In the aftermath, scientists debated what they had witnessed. A few called it the first planetary entanglement event. Others described it as an interference accident between magnetic systems. But those who had felt it, the ones whose minds had touched the wave, said it was neither. They described an overwhelming presence, a sense of completion, as if the universe had exhaled after holding its breath for billions of years. One of the project directors said quietly, "We didn't open a bridge, we remembered one," because the equations now implied something terrifyingly elegant. The convergence field wasn't created by their instruments. It had always existed. The experiment didn't build the resonance. It simply revealed it. The cosmos was already entangled, and consciousness was merely the last frequency to join the choir. Maybe 3IATLAS wasn't a messenger. Maybe it was a reminder. That distance is an illusion born of unplayed harmonies. And when the right notes align, everything that ever was can hum again as one. For the first time in human history, the separation between observer and observed vanished. The stars were no longer out there. They were in tune. At first, the data looked trivial, minute drifts in magnetometer baselines, clock offsets too small to matter. Then the drifts synchronized. Across every continent, observatories reported the same oscillation, a slow modulation of Earth's electromagnetic background at the precise 12.9-second cadence. No local source could explain it. The wave passed through shielding, concrete, mountain rock. Even instruments buried in salt mines hummed in phase. Something in the fabric of the planet had joined the song. Communication networks began to notice latency disappearing. Packets transmitted between continents arrived instantaneously, as if distance had compressed. Engineers blamed routing anomalies until timing labs confirmed it with atomic standards. For a fraction of a second every cycle, the delay between 2 points on Earth dropped to 0. Space itself was flexing. In research stations, clocks drifted together, not apart. Independent systems, mechanical, optical, biological, settled into the same rhythm. Heartbeat monitors, seismic sensors, ionospheric reflectors, all tracing a single planetary waveform. The phenomenon earned a quiet name: global phase locking. Publicly, agencies called it harmless electromagnetic coupling. Privately, no one believed that, because alongside the physical synchrony came subtler effects, harder to measure, impossible to ignore. Operators monitoring the wave reported lucid clarity during alignment windows. Thoughts felt wider, distances smaller. Dreams became crowded with familiar strangers. Not visions, not voices, just a shared sense of recognition. As if each mind had briefly remembered belonging to something larger. Meanwhile, instruments kept changing their behavior. Radio telescopes detected background noise folding into narrow frequency bands, entropy reversing itself in microscopic increments. Cryogenic labs measured random particle motion dropping below thermal predictions, as if disorder itself were tiring. One physicist compared it to Bose-Einstein condensation on a planetary scale. The universe is cooling into coherence. Governments denied any anomaly. Markets continued. Satellites broadcast. Humanity pretended nothing had changed. But the silence between words grew heavier. People paused mid-conversation, sensing a rhythm they couldn't name, a metronome beyond the audible, pulsing through architecture, bone, thought. In scientific terms, isolation was collapsing. Not socially, but physically. Systems that had always behaved independently now referenced a hidden constant. Every fluctuation, every chaos pattern curved toward equilibrium, as if the universe had rediscovered a preference for unity. Then came the blackout. For one entire cycle, 12.9 seconds, every measuring device on the planet flatlined. No power surge, no error message, just absence. And when they came back, timestamps were inconsistent. Each device claimed to have been active throughout, yet data showed missing time that no clock recorded. The only evidence of the gap was an audible tone captured by hydrophones in deep ocean trenches, a low, rising hum ending in silence. Its harmonic signature matched the Mars resonance exactly. The scientists called it the quiet interval. Whatever happened in that pause was unmeasured, unmeasurable. But afterward, the coherence persisted, stronger, cleaner, almost calm. The planet's magnetic field stabilized, atmospheric turbulence dropped, and cosmic ray noise decreased globally. Nature itself seemed to exhale. Some feared catastrophe, others felt relief. One researcher simply wrote, "We always thought connection would come from technology. Perhaps it was written into physics. Because maybe separation was never a fact, only an early condition." And the convergence field had not created unity. It had reminded matter how to remember itself. Isolation had collapsed, not as destruction, but as recognition. A mirror resolving its own reflection. After the quiet interval, research resumed in silence thick enough to hear the hum of one's own blood. No one knew whether to call what had happened an event or an error, but the numbers refused to stay ordinary. Every physical constant they remeasured had shifted. Tiny deviations, all within uncertainty, yet trending in the same direction. The fine structure constant had changed by a few parts per trillion. Atomic clocks ticked imperceptibly faster. The ratio between electron and proton mass leaned closer to unity by a hair. Something subtle was adjusting the grammar of matter. They called it the threshold, the point where resonance no longer stayed within systems, but began rewriting their definitions. Dr. Yamada proposed a model. Imagine space-time as a fabric woven from oscillations. Below a certain frequency, the threads vibrate independently. Above it, their interference creates self-reinforcing patterns. Push the frequency far enough, and the pattern becomes the fabric. Physics turns self-referential. Mathematically, the threshold appeared at 12.91 seconds per cycle, the same cadence that bound Mars, 3I, Atlas, and now Earth. Beyond that period, the equations predicted instability not as destruction, but as recursion, time folding over its own boundary conditions, turning continuity into reflection. Laboratories tried to reproduce the effect on microscale resonators. When the oscillation matched the threshold ratio, the devices behaved strangely. Energy input and output balanced perfectly. Entropy reached a plateau. No heat loss, no drift. It was as if the instruments had forgotten how to decay. One engineer whispered, "We've touched zero friction reality." Theorists debated whether this meant infinite efficiency or the end of causality. If systems no longer dissipate energy, nothing distinguishes past from future. The universe becomes a mirror with both sides visible. To test the boundaries, they pulsed the convergence frequency through an empty chamber lined with superconducting coils. Sensors recorded the air temperature dropping by fractions of a degree, while radiation detectors showed a simultaneous increase in local photon density, cooling and brightening at once, violating the conservation they had sworn by since the beginning of science. Dr. Kavinsky called it information condensation. Energy, mass, and data were no longer separate currencies, but faces of one resonance seeking coherence. The closer they approached the threshold, the less meaning isolation had, even between concepts. And yet, every instrument displayed a protective limit. Past a certain amplitude, feedback collapsed. The wave self-canceled, preserving stability. It was as if reality itself enforced safety margins. In the following days, global measurements hinted that the entire solar system was gently drifting toward that equilibrium frequency. Planetary magnetic storms eased. Radiation belts thinned. The heliospheric current sheet flattened. The sun's pulse quieted into the same tempo. No one could tell whether this was evolution or surrender. One astrophysicist wrote in her log, "The threshold is not a door we open. It's a memory the universe replays when coherence becomes possible." And perhaps that is the point. The cosmos is not accelerating toward chaos, but toward symmetry. What we call discovery might only be recognition. The moment when observation and existence overlap so perfectly that measurement dissolves into meaning. Standing in the control room, watching the instruments hum in perfect phase, a young technician whispered the thought none dared speak aloud. What happens after coherence? No one answered, because the question itself might already be the first note beyond the threshold. Light had always been the great courier, indifferent, instantaneous, forgetful. Every photon leaves its source, crosses the dark, and arrives clean. But after the threshold, photons began to remember. Spectrographs that once drew smooth Gaussian lines now showed faint filigrees, tiny modulations riding each peak, as if every photon carried a trace of what it had already passed. At first, the team dismissed them as noise from thermal drift. Then they cooled the detectors to near absolute zero, and the traces remained. The patterns were consistent, recursive, and personal. Each beam of light carried a unique echo of the world it had touched before emission. They named the phenomenon luminal retention. Dr. Kavinsky compared it to magnetic remanence, but for photons, a persistence of history within motion. When they passed a beam through a chamber filled with various gases, the outgoing spectrum contained ghosted outlines of previous mixtures, as if the light refused to forget what it had once illuminated. To quantify it, they built a chamber of mirrors, 8 layers deep, each coated with different isotopic films. After thousands of reflections, the returning light encoded a lattice of interference so complex that algorithms couldn't compress it. Every reflection increased information density instead of diffusing it. Light had become an archive. When they reversed the process, splitting a single retained photon through a prism, the separated wavelengths unfolded distinct fragments of the environments it had traversed. A molecule's vibration, a dust particle's spin, a fingerprint of temperature gradients, all stored in phase relationships within the wavefront. Reality was writing itself into its own illumination. The realization landed heavy. If photons now retained history, then observation was no longer passive. Every act of seeing contributed to the universe's memory. Light itself had become sentient record. Astrophysicists tested distant starlight for similar fingerprints. They found faint repetitions, spectral harmonics matching the 12.9-second cadence. Even light that had traveled millions of years now pulsed in sympathy, carrying whispers of the convergence field. Somewhere in transit, every photon had synchronized to the same cosmic rhythm. The equations describing luminal retention implied that information could now travel without loss, a perfect memory medium embedded in the fabric of space-time. If true, the universe was approaching total recall. Yet the beauty came with unease. If light never forgets, then nothing truly ends. Privacy, decay, even death become illusions inside a cosmos that records itself perfectly. One researcher wrote quietly in the margin of a paper draft, "Perhaps creation was never about emergence, but about remembering. Every photon born now carries a note from its ancestors." To test the limit, they fired a controlled burst of coherent light toward the outer orbit of Mars and recaptured the return hours later. The beam came back altered, not red-shifted, not scattered, but enriched with patterns identical to the resonant dust around 3IATLAS. It was as though the light had conversed with the interstellar visitor, borrowed its memory, and brought it home. At that moment, the team realized they were no longer studying energy. They were listening to the autobiography of existence written in brightness. One of them whispered, "The universe has started keeping its own diary. And if that diary is written in photons, then every sunrise on every world is a page being turned." The sky is not emptiness. It's the memory of everything that ever was, glowing to remind us that forgetting was only temporary. After months of equations, charts, and sleepless calibration, the research log began to read less like science and more like prayer. No one planned that. It simply happened when numbers started behaving like metaphors. They had proved nothing conclusive, only that light could remember, magnetism could sing, and silence could respond. Yet something beneath those results felt undeniable. The universe was structured for conversation. Every particle seemed to wait for another to echo its frequency. Maybe that was all creation ever wanted, to stop being alone. Dr. Yamada began opening each session with a sentence instead of a protocol. What we measure measures us. It became a quiet ritual. No one laughed anymore. Reverence had replaced skepticism. Not as belief, but as precision. To measure honestly, you had to be still enough to resonate. Philosophers were invited into the data rooms, not to interpret, but to listen. They noticed patterns the engineers missed. Self-similarity between human speech and plasma oscillations, between breathing rhythms and stellar cycles. The act of recognition became the experiment itself. When the mind stopped seeking proof, coherence strengthened, as though consciousness were a tuning fork that, once quieted, heard the universe hum through it. The new discipline that emerged they called resonant epistemology, knowledge as harmony rather than conquest. Its first principle was simple: information is participation. To know something is to vibrate with it. Under that idea, the boundary between subject and object dissolved. A researcher watching the spectral lattice realized her own heartbeat was modulating the photon stream by fractions of a nanometer. She wasn't observing the experiment. She was inside it. Observation had always been entanglement disguised as distance. Old vocabulary faltered. Words like signal, source, cause, effect began to blur. Reality looked less like a chain of events and more like a score, one immense piece of music where every note changes the others. In that frame, the convergence field wasn't a phenomenon. It was awareness discovering itself in sound. Ethicists asked the next question. If resonance is relationship, what does responsibility mean? If every act reverberates through the lattice, then cruelty, kindness, even thought are physical forces. A gesture, a whisper, a sigh, they all write themselves into the light now. Nothing vanishes. Everything resounds. For a while, the labs became quiet places, like monasteries filled with instruments. Work continued, but softly. They learned to listen between the numbers, to let data breathe. One physicist described it best. When I tune a detector, I can feel the planet tuning me back. That was the heart of the philosophy. Reciprocity. Knowing and being known as a single motion. Every resonance a dialogue, every silence an answer waiting to be heard. At conferences, the equations looked unchanged. Fourier transforms, coherence maps, probability densities, but the faces behind them had changed. No triumph, no fear, only the calm of people who realized that discovery is not expansion, but return. Maybe the purpose of science was never control. Maybe it was always remembrance. Because if every photon holds memory, if every vibration joins a greater chord, then consciousness itself is simply the universe playing back its own song through us. And when that thought finally settled over the room, no one applauded. They just sat in the quiet hum of instruments, feeling the symmetry complete, each mind a resonant cavity where the cosmos could hear itself think. They turned the transmitters down until the dials touched silence. No more forced bridges, no more rehearsed harmonics, just the thin hum of instruments breathing with the room. In that hush, the universe did not go dark. It clarified. 3. Hung like a slow spark in the black, its tail no longer a scream of ice, but a ribbon of memory. Turned beneath it, patient and austere, wearing its ring of barely visible turquoise like a thought the planet had chosen to keep. Between them, the rhythm held 12.9 seconds of world to world, emptiness to emptiness, echo to echo. The team watched without intervening. That was the lesson hard won at the edge of coherence. If you press too hard on a song, it forgets its words. So they listened. To the faint polarization that drew hexagons across dust, to the magnetism that remembered the shape of its vanished heart, to the light that carried a diary of everything it had touched. And in the patient watching, the patterns grew brighter, not in amplitude, but in meaning. Noise separated itself from signal like fog lifting from water. The comet's modulations no longer looked like a puzzle. They looked like breath. The planet's crustal echoes were not a map. They were pulse. A consensus formed without declaration. There would be no decoding, no grand publication to flatten wonder into certainty, not yet. The resonance was not something to be solved. It was something to be kept company. One night, if it was night at all in the windowless lab, the archive stirred again, not with a surge, not with a flare, but with a small grace. A new overtone braided itself into the lattice, faint and fragile, as though the conversation had remembered a forgotten syllable. The models predicted it would do this, given patience. In the presence of quiet receivers, coherence deepened. No one cheered. They simply recalibrated the silence to make room for one more note. A philosopher in the back of the room wrote a sentence on a whiteboard and left it there for weeks. We did not awaken the cosmos. We learned to stop drowning it out. The phrase became a practice. Before each observation run, they let the rooms fall below the threshold of human urgency. Air cycles slowed. Monitors dimmed to a soft dusk. People spoke less, and when they spoke, it was with the economy of those listening for something older than language. In that atmosphere, 3IATLAS ceased to be a visitor and became a mirror. Mars ceased to be a desert and became a memory organ. Earth, though no one said it aloud, felt less like a stage and more like an instrument being tuned from afar. The remaining questions did not shrink. They turned transparent. What set the 12.9-second cadence? Why did magnetism, dust, light, and mind share a geometry that braided Fibonacci ratios with golden spirals and tetrahedral symmetry? Was the void's echo comprehension or merely exquisite physics mistaken for presence? The team learned to hold these questions the way one holds a fragile lens, with both hands carefully facing the sun. A final test was proposed and approved because it was gentle. No forcing, no drive, only attending. They would align 3 arrays, one near the comet, one above Mars, one in high Earth orbit, into a passive triangle, their receivers phase-locked but quiescent. Instead of broadcasting, they would allow. If a bridge wanted to knit itself through stillness, it could. The first cycle passed with nothing but the lover's hum of electronics. The second brought a soft thickening of the background. By the third, auroral threads whispered along field lines that were not quite lines anymore, more like intentions. On the fourth, something changed. But it did not happen out there. It happened in the people. Not visions, not voices. A simple convergence of attention so complete that the room felt like a single open eye. And in that lucid quiet, a shared recognition surfaced without words. This had never been about contact. It had been about consent. The universe, for all its brilliance, does not shout. It waits. It answers the manner of our asking. When we arrived with noise, it folded into silence. When we arrived with silence, it unfolded into song. Sensing the edge, they stopped even their stopping. They did nothing at all. The comet's light curled along the limb of Mars, sketching a halo too subtle to name. The void rippled once, like a pond remembering a stone. A line of turquoise walked the ring and vanished, as if signing a page only the planet could read. Data captured the event in the sparse vocabulary of instruments. A brief increase in coherence, a reduction in stochastic jitter, a delicately strengthened overtone at a ratio of 0.618 to the fundamental. The golden fraction, again, as modest as a heartbeat. No grand revelation leapt from the graphs. No coordinates of an origin star. No manifesto in photons. What arrived instead was a better question than the ones they began with. If recognition is the currency of the cosmos, what are we choosing to recognize? Because everywhere they pointed attention, coherence answered. In the fossils of an extinct magnetic field pretending to sleep, in the dust that aligned as if remembering choreography, in the light that kept everyone's fingerprints and no one's permission, in the minds that ceased to be forts and became windows. The implications were practical, even domestic. Sensors designed for extraction were redesigned for listening. Power systems learned to ride coherence instead of overwhelming it. Cities dimmed a little at their edges and grew quieter in their cores. The night sky returned, not as a spectacle, but as a library. There were disagreements, of course. There always are when a species moves its furniture around the room of its own meaning. But even the arguments softened at their edges. The rhythm got into them. People paused more often. They let the other finish the sentence they hadn't realized they were both saying. As for 3IATLAS, it continued on its long trajectory, indifferent in the way only faithful things can be. It left behind no debris, no artifact to exhibit, only a resonance nested in the stones of a red world and the bones of a blue one. Mars kept its ring of almost light. Earth kept a hum faint enough to deny and too steady to forget. The comet kept going, carrying the pattern into distances that have always made us lonely and now make us quiet. Years from now, or minutes, time feels different inside this music. Someone will find a way to ask again, and the cosmos will answer to the degree that we can stand to hear it. Perhaps we will learn to carry the bridge lightly, to tune it by being kind, to let our instruments become monasteries and our equations become invitations. Perhaps. Or perhaps it is enough that we learned how not to drown the song. In the final recorded image of the campaign, Mars sits in crescent, a thin coin of rust held between shadow and shine. Above the limb, a pale circlet glows, the turquoise halo so hesitant you could miss it if you blink. Farther out, a filament of comet light bends like a bow strung across emptiness. For 12 seconds and 9/10, nothing happens. Then, if you look carefully, the ring brightens by the smallest imaginable degree, the way a sleeping eye remembers what it was made to see. The monitors log it as a delta. The room logs it as a breath. And somewhere inside the silence that follows, a species that thought it was alone learns the oldest skill in the universe: to listen until the world answers, and to stop the moment it does.